Maybe it's the overabundance of AI images, maybe it's because I've been doing digital art for so long, or maybe it's just that the tactile sensation sets off something in my caveman brain, but I've been finding myself getting more and more into traditional art recently, rather than digital. And if you clicked on this video, maybe you've been thinking about it too. After a pretty big failure that I'll talk about later in this video, I made this painting using only traditional materials as someone who has been solely working digital for years. Switching between the two can be very messy, but rewarding. How do you know which medium's right for you though? There's a ton of options. You have graphite, charcoals, pastels, watercolor, acrylic, oil, ink, colored pencils, markers, and that's just a few. How could you try them all, and is it even worth trying them all? As someone who has a lot of trial and error in almost all 2D mediums, I'd like to share with you what I found, and maybe my experience can help you find your own perfect traditional art medium. The reason why I clung to digital art for so long was one word: freedom. Digital art allows you to make anything at any time. You just open up your preferred drawing program and start working. No setting up equipment or waiting for things to dry. You have brushes that feel like watercolor and ones that feel like oil painting. Pens that feel like graphite and ones that feel like ink. And you can mix these all together at any time to create something great. The trouble I had with finding and sticking to a traditional medium is the lack of freedom I had with them. Graphite and charcoal I liked, but I wanted something with color. Oil paint was nice and smooth, but each layer of paint could take up to a week to dry before the next layer of paint could be added, and I don't have the patience. Acrylic had better drying times, but lacked the smoothness and creaminess of oil paint and dries too glossy for me. I like watercolor, but applying paint so thinly just wasn't as satisfying as other paints. Color pencils were great for adding details, but if you want to fill in large areas of color quickly, you were out of luck. All of these mediums are great in their own right, and there are plenty of masters in each one that create very inspiring work. It's just that none of these really resonated with me as much as digital has. I was feeling pretty lost, and then I found it. A way to combine everything I liked about a few of these mediums into one. Take the parts I enjoy of each medium and discard what I don't. Gouache. Gouache falls somewhere in between acrylic and watercolor, but is a bit thicker and more pigmented than watercolor. It also dries with a matte finish, allowing you to use colored pencils or even markers on top of the paint. You can use it thinly like watercolors, or as thick as it comes from the tube, similar to acrylic. So I finally had it. The best medium for me was actually a mix of mediums, with the main one being gouache. I did it. I found it. All there's left to do is make an incredible painting with it now. Well, let me explain. I was excited when I started to dive into gouache and started to do some studies in my sketchbook and a few smaller paintings, just to experiment with the medium. I made this little Ace painting from One Piece, then did this Zoro, this Tom Hardy painting, and this medium-sized Samus painting, along with a few smaller ones. I really tried to experiment as much as possible with these. I didn't stick to one style or one way of working. I tried out different types of paints, papers, and brushes. The studies were going well, and I feel like I was learning a lot and getting better with each one. That's when I decided to make this video about learning a new medium, and I was going to have a big painting to end the whole video. The first few paintings at least gave me the confidence to move on to something bigger and cap off this new mastered medium. But hey, when I tried to paint over some areas that were already dried, the paint would reactivate and kind of create a muddy mess. This was very apparent in that Samus painting, especially in the background. I wanted to create sort of a colorful galaxy and I wasn't able to, since I couldn't really layer the paints like I wanted. But I'm sure that won't come back to haunt me, so let's just ignore it. So I started working on a bigger painting. I do a lot of Zelda fan art, so I thought doing a Tears of the Kingdom inspired piece would be a layup for me. I began by doing some quick, loose sketches to get my idea onto paper. The concept was fairly simple. It was just going to have Link in the center with the light dragon sort of wrapping around him. I kind of just freestyled this thumbnailing stage where I sort of went back and forth between traditional and digital. My initial idea wasn't really turning out like I'd hoped, since when the light dragon was wrapping around him, it had to be made really small in order for the composition to still work. So I ended up scrapping that idea and just making the head go directly behind him. I didn't really love this idea as much. The composition wasn't quite as strong, but I figured I could still make it look cool. I sketched out the painting on a pretty big sized piece of watercolor paper and began painting. I was enjoying it at first and made a lot of progress and thought it still had the potential to turn out good. But as I continue to paint, the combination of the weak composition along with gouache's inability to allow areas to be painted over without reactivating the previous layer of paint was really starting to take effect and becoming more and more annoying. I remember this becoming very apparent while painting the clouds and the dragon's head, and know it would have gotten even worse when I got to really painting and detailing Link himself. Every painting session became more and more frustrating than the last one. Until one night I sat down to record and paint more process, and I took a hard look at the painting. So I've taken a couple days away from the painting. This is the stage I'm at right now. The time away kind of made me come back to it with fresh eyes, and I kind of realized it's just not working out how I would like it to. And I think it would just be better to stop now and move on to another painting, and hopefully that one goes better. Sorry if that clip came off a little too dramatic. I hold myself to a high standard, but I had also just finished watching a particularly sad episode of Arcane. But yeah, I don't like the painting anymore. The limitations of gouache really came back to haunt me. I think if I had the ability to paint over areas and change the colors and values up a bit more, I could have come up with something decent, but honestly I just think the composition was weak as well. The pose was boring, and I've also made the composition good in the thumbnailing stage, and by doing so this concept was just doomed from the start. Plus there's like no color harmony anymore. It looks like I just picked a bunch of random super bright saturated colors and just plopped them onto the paper. The thumbnail is the base that everything will be built off of, and if that isn't good, the final result probably won't be good either. I got too eager, a little too confident, and I rushed it. It looks like gouache isn't my perfect medium either. That's fine though, it's not like I've tried a ton of other mediums. I can't keep doing this. I know what some of you are probably thinking. It's not the medium's fault, it's the artist, and you have to learn to work with it. And you're absolutely right. But I discovered something that could fix the issues that I had with gouache, and that is acrylic gouache. Yes, there is a medium that falls in between acrylic paint and regular gouache, where the paint still dries matte like gouache, but since it's also acrylic, it will dry completely and will not reactivate nearly as much as regular gouache when using very watery layers. I put it into practice on a few studies, and it was exactly what I was looking for. I did a portrait just based off a photo I found on Pinterest. I used a very limited color palette, and while I was struggling with first just getting used to the medium, being able to add layers of more paint or colored pencils really helped the end result, and I think it turned out pretty solid. I did another one. I mentioned earlier I was watching Arcane, so like every other artist watching Arcane, it made me want to paint stuff based around Arcane, so I did some buy studies. Painting is never easy, but I have to say working with this medium feels like a breath of fresh air, and I can see so many possibilities with it. I feel like I may have done it. I may have found a traditional medium that feels nearly as free as digital. This could be what I've been searching for. I'm gonna make another big painting trying out this new paint and approach. And these buy studies turned out decently well for only being done in a couple of hours. I'm sticking with the Zelda theme again, and I'm going to do a more traditional style portrait of Link in his knight armor. I made my reference image a bit different this time. I went into the actual game and took photos of Link in the knight outfit, and photoshopped a couple of them together to get the pose I wanted. I then did sort of a digital matte painting over top of it in order to make it more in my style and just give it more of the look I'm going for. I don't want to make it exactly how it looks in the game. Starting the actual painting by sketching it out in graphite on a 15 by 20 piece of hot press watercolor paper. I began by doing an underpainting using really only one hue, sort of a burnt umber color. At this stage, I'm really only thinking about value and trying to get a good base to work off of. I wasn't happy with the colors in my last painting, so this is a way to start them off being a bit more harmonious. Also, if you want to play a fun game, you can find the exact moments when I start to understand the new camera I bought bit by bit as the video quality slowly improves as the painting goes on. Sorry it's not the best to start off. I could tell almost immediately after starting the painting how much I actually enjoyed acrylic gouache compared to regular gouache. It just feels so much freer to me. If I wanted to paint thick, I could. If I wanted to paint thin, I could. If I wanted to repaint any areas, I easily could. I'm actually enjoying this. Here's a better quality close-up of the finished underpainting, and it came together pretty quickly. Now adding in more color over top of the underpainting, starting with the background. Doing this would have been impossible with regular gouache due to it reactivating, so it's nice to have this freedom. I like to do this in my digital work a lot too, or start with a base value painting and then I move on from there, and this feels very similar to that. Adding more local colors on top of the base using a mix of thick and thin layers, starting with the armor. I'm doing all the armor at once since I already have those colors mixed on my palette. I actually like working this way. It really gets me focused in on one area or one material, instead of just jumping around a bunch like I do in digital. And I'm doing my best to add color while not losing the values I had in the underpainting. Moving on to the skin and hair. I feel like the skin and hair always takes a little bit of time to get right regardless of the medium. But just remembering the basic forms of the face and the direction of where the light is coming from usually gets me to a better spot. And I feel like this came together relatively quickly given that I'm still a beginner in this medium. As far as I know, acrylic gouache is a much lesser known medium in the art world. I was talking to a friend of mine who actually owns an art studio, and I told him I was really enjoying painting in acrylic gouache recently, and he said, "Acrylic gouache is a thing?" And I was like, yeah, apparently. I had no idea either. So it's not just me. I've also noticed that a lot of my favorite artists who use regular gouache don't use it for bigger, more in-depth work. They use it for more sketchy, looser stuff, and then switch to a different medium when they're doing a bigger painting. Because I think regular non-acrylic gouache lends itself better to looser work. Not to say you can't make something great with regular gouache, but I do understand why they do this now. I'm painting a flower behind Link, and if you're a Zelda fan, you probably know it's called a Silent Princess, and has a lot of symbolism in both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. I always like to include little things like this in my work, whether original or fan art. I just think adding even a little bit of symbolism in your work can really create more interest in it. I definitely learned a lot throughout this whole process, so here are some of the main things. Just a heads up, I'm not sponsored by anything I talk about, these are just some helpful tips. Tips for using this specific medium. Number 1, a Stay Wet palette. This is my biggest recommendation, it is super helpful. This palette will keep your paints damp so they don't dry out on the palette. And water-based paints like acrylic gouache dry out very quickly. It does so by having this thin sponge that you wet, and then placing a piece of thin palette paper on top of the sponge. I'd recommend this for all water-based paints. It'll keep your paints fresh and vibrant, sometimes even for days. Number 2, paper. I use Arches hot press 140-pound watercolor paper. I use cold press for some of the paintings in this video too. The only difference between the two is that hot press has a smooth surface and cold press has a more textured one. I like both, but I found that the colored pencils go on better to the smooth surface of the hot press. Number 3, paint. I use acrylic gouache from both Hoblin and Turner. I thought both worked well, but have been buying more Hoblin recently, since they come in bigger tubes and specific colors are easier to get for me. I also use Prismacolor pencils and they're great too. Number 4, brushes. I don't really have any go-to specific brushes that I really like. I recommend just having a mix of both round and flat brushes. Maybe with more practice I'll have more of a preference. Now here are some tips for digital artists trying to get into traditional art. Number 1, most important tip, get your thumbnails right. Do a lot of thumbnails and be happy with it before you move on to the bigger painting. It's a lot easier to fix problems in the beginning stage than any other. You may feel like you're wasting time in this stage, but you are not, and it's all part of the process. In digital art, you can move stuff around, change colors with ease at really any point in the process, and that isn't possible with traditional art. So you have to have a good base to work off of, make a good reference photo, and get to it. Number 2, don't worry about not having an undo button. It's really not that big of a deal not having one. It's still relatively easy to fix a misplacement of a brushstroke with a simple wipe of a towel. And some mistakes you make may actually end up not to be mistakes at all, and they may spark some creative ideas that you wouldn't have found otherwise. Also, if you're used to flipping your canvas a lot digitally, you can use your phone to take a photo of your traditional art, edit it, act like you're going to crop it, and then just hit this flip horizontal button to get that fresh perspective. Number 3, Make your traditional art setup as easy and convenient as possible. As digital artists, we're so used to being able to work at any time, whenever we want. If your traditional art setup is just a hassle to set up, you're going to be way less likely to actually sit down and paint or draw. I keep all my supplies in the same area and it makes setup way easier. Plus, with the Stay Wet palette, you can keep your paints damp for days, so you don't necessarily have to mix a bunch of paints every time. But recently I have been finding some, I don't know, just kind of peace in the setup and cleanup. It's mundane, sure, but it's also part of the process and can be a little relaxing. I don't know, maybe that's just me. Also, I feel like I learned a lot more about art while doing these paintings. Since you have to mix the paints yourselves to get the colors you want, it forces you to understand colors a bit better. It's very easy to pick a hue from the color wheel without really thinking about it. And I think this can become a crutch to lean on instead of really taking the time to understand how colors work. Plus, when you do make a mistake, you learn from it a lot more in traditional art. When you draw someone's head out of place or missized in digital art, you can very easily adjust it to be more correct. But did you learn from that? It was so easy to fix, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal, and before you know it, you're drawing your heads out of place every time. I'm guilty of stuff like this myself. But if you draw the head out of place in traditional art, you have to erase it and redraw it. It's more work, but I think just the act of redrawing it completely will help you see your mistakes more and create a better learning experience, and may help you not make these mistakes in the future. As I continue painting, I'm adding mostly colored pencils with a little bit of markers on top of the paint. I try to leave the details for this stage and not to overdo it. Just try to create more color vibrancy and just improve the areas that I think need a little help and could benefit from a little extra detail. The color pencils being obviously a very solid medium, so it makes it very satisfying to actually press down with some force and get the colors and detail I want. It wasn't the end result about finding the perfect medium or creating a good painting. It was about the friends we made along the way. Wait, what? I mean, it's about the lessons I learned from each previous painting, drawing, in whatever medium that led me here. I'm not giving up digital art by any means, I still really enjoy it. I was able to apply a lot of the principles I learned in digital art to my traditional art, but there really is something about getting your hands covered in paint and making something tangible. Something one of one, good or bad. Like I said, I'm not sponsored by any acrylic gouache brands, even though I would like to be, and this isn't an ad for them either. This is just a medium I just really didn't know existed that I really enjoy. But your perfect medium may be completely different than mine. You may enjoy how long it takes oil paint to dry, since it blends better and gives you more time to push the paint around. Or you may love the thinness of watercolor, and the process of slowly building up color and value with each new layer. Everyone's different. A big lesson here is yes, finding the perfect medium for you can absolutely help your work. But if you rush the process or if your skills aren't where they need to be to achieve the goals you want, no medium can really fix that. And each medium will have its learning curve. You'll probably not find your perfect medium on the first try, and it will probably take a lot of experimenting like it did for me. You don't always have to buy a ton of really expensive materials to try out different mediums. Start small with some basic stuff. A few tubes of paint and a few brushes can create an amazing array of colors and a ton of options to explore. It may look like I bought a ton of materials to make this video, but most of this stuff was accumulated over the course of maybe 8 years. I'm happy with how this painting is turning out, but I'm still a beginner at acrylic gouache and still have a lot to learn in this medium and just as an artist in general. My advice would be to take it slow. Even if I didn't stick to each medium I tried, I still learned a lot from them that I was able to apply to pretty much all other mediums, and my art skills in general. I've heard other artists talk about how traditional art almost feels like a live performance. In live performances, there are little mistakes everywhere. They're inevitable. Whether it's missing a note while playing a song, being a little out of step during a play, or striking out at home plate. Even the best of people in their fields make these mistakes. I feel like in digital art we can get so caught up in trying to make everything perfect because we can change anything at any time. Sometimes I think that can hold us back from our pieces being maybe more interesting, imperfections and all. Try different mediums, find ones you hate, find ones you love, paint, draw, make good paintings, make bad paintings, don't overcomplicate it, and just make art. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps out. I hope you like the final painting. There are prints available in the description to this video through my in-print shop, if anybody's interested. I hope you got something out of this video, and if there's any other mediums that you prefer as a digital artist or just as an artist in general, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear what your go-to medium is. Also, thanks for all the support recently. Just hit over 2,000 subscribers. I know that may not sound like a lot to a lot of people, but I wasn't really sure if anybody was going to watch these videos. But yeah, thanks again, and keep on making art. Any final words, Link? Thanks.